Okay, let's look at Standard 10, Substandard D. Explain black codes, the Ku Klux Klan, and other forms of resistance to racial equity during Reconstruction. We talked about the black codes before. We're going to revisit them here, and on our timeline of Reconstruction events, we saw that after the 13th Amendment ended slavery, lots of Southern whites in their states passed these black codes to try to reduce the impact of the 13th Amendment giving freedom to African Americans. Alright, so let's jump back into these black codes. Let's talk about their intentions first. Let's look at those three big ones. The black codes were intended to restrict or keep civil liberties from black people, keep them from having equitable opportunities or freedoms that whites would have. Those were open to black people during Reconstruction. So to keep that from having those, they passed these black codes to keep these former slaves subordinate to whites. In other words, inferior to whites. The second intention, these black codes were passed to force African Americans or black Americans back to work under conditions that closely resembled slavery. In other words, still use them in the fields, put them back to work, even though it's not called, quote, slavery. And then the third intention here was that Southern states passed these laws due to pressure by Southern people who called for laws to control free blacks, to force them back into bondage, but also to deny them equality with whites. Closely ties into this first one up here. Alright, so let's look at our first essential question. How did black codes deny civil liberties and liberty to free African Americans? And it ties in, and that's this first one here. If we look at these black codes, there were laws, and codes are laws basically that are codified or put in books and recorded, that are made by state general assemblies or state legislatures that make the law. Alright, so these codes are passed, these laws. One of them is that interracial marriages were prohibited between whites and blacks. And then another one was that blacks could not testify in jury trials involving whites. They could not serve in a jury, on a jury in a court whatsoever. Okay, so they were restricted from doing that. Blacks could not own farmlands in Mississippi, and in South Carolina they couldn't own city lots. And there were rules where they couldn't be in town after midnight. And then other states they could own some land, and then blacks did not have the right to vote, and they couldn't carry weapons like knives or guns without license or permits. And then if whites interpreted their language as insulting or their gestures as insulting, then blacks could be put in jail because those certain types of language and gestures were made illegal. And then blacks and whites could not assemble together during the day or night. Unlawful assembly was against the law, and you could be put in jail for that. And then blacks could not attend schools with whites. And then, of course, segregation laws keeping blacks and whites separate within society were passed under these black codes. Alright, the next one is, how did black codes force free African Americans to work under conditions that resemble slavery? And we talked about that one in the middle one here. And these particular black codes here, and the black codes generally, at the core of these black codes lay this matter of labor, of work. There's no longer slavery, but we still need somebody to work in the fields, is the way the plantation owner farmers thought about this. So since slavery was over, there was a shortage of labor in all these fields. So these plantation owners and farmers put pressure on politicians, who were legislatures, who then went to their state legislature to make these laws, these codified laws called black codes. And their main intent and purpose was to hurry these free blacks who had received freedom, to hurry them back to the plantations by force, even if they didn't want to go, to make them work, to make them be that source of labor. So all these laws reduced free men back into bondage. And they were trying to restore southern states were trying to restore all the vestiges of forced labor without the name slavery attached to it. So that's what all these black codes, their intent and purpose were. And you wasn't at all odd at all to see a lot of straight African Americans on a chain gang prison crew where they had been violating vagrancy laws just to put them back to work in the fields. Alright, and then it says, explain the Ku Klux Klan and other forms of resistance to racial equity during Reconstruction. And these forms of racial resistance come after the 14th and 15th Amendment. If you remember, the KKK was created in 1866 in Tennessee, Pulaski, Tennessee, in 1866, and it was around this time that these radical Republicans actually passed through the House and the Senate a proposal for the 14th Amendment, and it took a year and a half later before it was actually ratified. But around the time they proposed the 14th Amendment, giving equality and giving citizenship and giving all these due process rights to African Americans, was that when the KKK was instituted. So the Ku Klux Klan was brought out. But Ku Klux Klan really picks up, really becomes a force in the South after the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to African American men, black male suffrage. February 3rd, 1870, it was ratified. So in response to this suffrage by black men, the southern states instituted devices to resist this racial equity in voting. One was the KKK, and the Ku Klux Klan was a white supremacist organization where these white people, usually very well-to-do people in town, would dress up in these robes, and they would go out and intimidate African Americans. They tried to keep African Americans from voting, so they deprived them of their voting rights. They used violence and intimidation, murder, even arson, threatening actions like whippings, lynchings, kidnappings, house burnings, cross burnings in yards, to try to keep African Americans from exercising their vote, which was their right because of the 15th Amendment. African American men, A poll tax was also created to keep African Americans from voting, and a poll tax basically had to pay money to vote, and a lot of African Americans were too poor to vote. And I got here from Birmingham, Alabama. Here's a receipt from a poll tax in 1896, where someone voted and had to pay $1.50 for the poll tax, and then for an assessor's fee 50 cents, a collector's fee 50 cents. So $2.50 just to vote in 1896. This is a poll tax receipt. So this is a way to keep African Americans who had just received the vote in the 15th Amendment from voting. If they didn't have the money, they couldn't vote, or maybe they wouldn't vote because they want to spend the money on something else. Literacy test was another device to keep African Americans from voting. That before you could vote, you had to take a test first to see if you could read and write. Here's an example from Louisiana. I'll enlarge it in just a second. If you could pass a reading and writing test, you could vote. And a lot of African Americans were not literate. They were illiterate, couldn't read and write. So this is a way to keep African Americans from voting and to resist this 15th Amendment African male suffrage amendment. And here it is here. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. So you had to draw a line around this number. Draw a line under the last word in this line. So you had to draw a line here. And if people couldn't read that and they couldn't do it, it would keep them from voting. And another one, of course, the poll tax kept white people from voting because they didn't have money, or maybe needed to spend the money on something else. And then a lot of white people were illiterate as well after the Civil War. And the grandfather clause was a way to let white people in, way to let white people vote and not black people, because it stated if your grandfather voted prior to 1867, then you could vote too. Or if your grandfather fought in the Civil War on the South Side as a Confederate soldier, then you could vote. So how many African Americans were allowed to fight on the Southern side, and then how many African Americans' grandfather had the right to vote in the South? So it's a way to keep African Americans from exercising the 15th Amendment. Here's an example of a grandfather clause here. Notice down here it says, I do solemnly swear affirm that I am a citizen of the United States and the state of North Carolina. I'm 53 years old. And then it says, or I am a lineal descendant of William Moody. And so this shows that his grandfather voted. This allows him to vote. It says his grandfather voted, was entitled to vote under, and look at the year, who was on January 1st, 1867, or prior to that date, entitled to vote under the constitutional laws of the state of North Carolina. So that was a way to get whites to be allowed to vote who were illiterate and poor, but still keep African Americans from exercising their 15th Amendment right to vote. So our original purpose here was to explain the black codes I think we have and their intentions with those, and then the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and other forms of resistance to racial equity during Reconstruction. If you got any questions, ask me in class. Watch the video again. Good luck on the test and the EOCT.